Hey everybody, welcome back to another Decklab, whatever you want to call it, where I just rate the decks that you sent in. Now this is a 1 versus 1 rank deck, where the user or the individual who sent it in says, as I'm new to rank, any advice in 1 versus 1 rank deck building would be nice. So here we go, Commonwealth for 1 versus 1 ranked. Now, Commonwealth has been not insignificantly buffed. With the patch, SAS and ground transports, 10% availability bonus, Highlanders 90 being cheaper, and one of the most important, indirect buffs to like all of the previously much weaker nations has been that, all the top tier decks got nerfed, right? Especially for dragons, red dragons is actually the most impactful, relative strength increase that they got, if you want to call it that. Now, logistics. Not a fan of GPCVs. However, if you only want to run 4 cards of the logistics tab with fob and supply truck, it's hard to really get away or get around that. Because typically I'd say 8 CVs is the minimum, 7 is playable, but you should, in my eyes, for ranked, have at least 8. If you play 1 versus 1 and you know the deck beforehand, then you can adjust things. That's a different story. But of course, you have to account for having to play a nuclear winter or having to play against someone who snipes a lot of CVs, etc. So I'm gonna keep it like this. Infantry is always good to have because you can hide them very well. Is on many zones or many maps can be a lot harder to kill than, let's say, tank CVs. And then of course cheap CV for the availability. And if you wanna go for a cheap CV, the Iltis is the way to go. Either that or the other two, but they're practically the same. In fact, the Iltis is technically a bit better because of better autonomy. A fob, okay. Supply truck, I mean, I can't really tell you what you should do. Personally, I prefer the 30-point ones because they're just simply faster. But 15-point works fine as well. It's really up to you. There's no objectively right or wrong thing, or not even close to an objectively right or wrong thing. So I'm gonna keep it like that for now. Maybe we'll revisit the logistics tab later. Infantry tab. SAS and links aren't inherently bad. I would still suggest not doing it, because with SAS now coming in the Saxons, they are going to be quite crucial to your air defense. In team games, it's not as big of a deal, but in 1 versus 1s, it definitely is. Because as you see right now, first of all, none of your AA is wheeled, right? So you have no wheeled AA, nothing wheeled to support your Vickers Mark 11s against helicopters, right? So that's why you definitely should consider getting them in the Saxon, and I will do just that. Commandos 9 in the Aslav, very good choice. They're incredibly good all-purpose shock infantry. Of course, they're gonna struggle a bit against heavier armored targets, more heavily armored targets. There we go. But other than that, they murder infantry like other squads can't really. At least not for this price. Highlanders 90, also good choice with the price buff at 20 points, a lot more affordable. Your anti-tank infantry, your main anti-tank infantry, I would up with them. 11 is still plenty. And you mainly really need them for really tough tanks, right? The commandos and SS will do just fine against IFVs and low tier tanks, right? Or if you happen to sideshot them. But you can definitely consider upweighting them, and I would certainly suggest doing so because they're only regular. They're gonna struggle a bit against infantry for the price. And 11, like I said, is still plenty. Canadian Rifle in a TH, it's a solid card. These days I don't use it as much, but I'm not saying not saying that's definitely the way to go. Infantry tab in Commonwealth is still not as figured out, at least for me, like other infantry tabs are for other decks. So if you want like a relatively affordable card, that like all-round purpose card with like IV, line infantry, etc., it is a good choice. Something else that you can do is you run, if you struggle with meat shields, run the diggers in a 5-pointer. They're not good meat shields, not amazing meat shields, right? None of the 5-pointers that line infantry has in Commonwealth has more than 1 front armor. So you don't have something like Rifleman, Zelda, Roviden Zelda, So Chung Soon, K200, etc. You don't have anything of that spam, and that is really noticeable for Commonwealth. So yeah, you gotta do what you gotta do. So that's why I'm not saying you should do that. In fact, I'm, for example, right now, or like have been, trying out territorials even. 5-pointers garbage, but at least they're cheap. Some of the stuff I can't tell you what to do. You have to figure out yourself. And then Saxon and Milan, good choice. I would probably upvet them. They are Milan too, so you're not gonna spam them around. But yeah, your infantry tab itself wasn't really too bad. What you get, other options that you can do is you run instead of commandos, because you have decent fire support. You are not quite as reliant on commandos. You could run Gurkhas or paratroopers, or run them instead of Highlanders 90 if you want some low 80s, or instead of the Canadian Rifles 85, Fusilier 90s in a 5-pointer. Lot of choices, and it's not as cut and dry what the infantry tab should look like as it is for other decks. Though that is probably also just partially because over the past few years, barely anyone has really bought with Commonwealth. But yeah, Saxon, SS and Saxon are honestly kind of a must. And for Link's 87 drops, you still have other infantry to go for. Supportive Stormer, kind of a must-have. It's an incredibly good vehicle. I would consider upvetting this. It's not really the most frontline vehicle, so it's not going to be in direct fire as much. And it has 3 front armor, so up front it's going to take not as much damage. And of course, with SAS in a Saxon being a lot more affordable and being easier to get to a contested frontline, they help out a lot more than they previously have. Tractor Rapier FSA, solid AAPs for interplane, good choice. Falcon, I would not use. Straight up, don't go for it. The actual output of the Falcon isn't horrible. Armor is a bit lacking, speed of course not great. The biggest issue is just it runs out of ammo so gosh darn quickly. So it can defeat like 1, maybe 2 helicopters and it's out of ammo. And that's not good. Not good at all. So base defense AA is just a bit awkward for Commonwealth. But typically you're just good of like having some THs or something like that around. Now what would you use for another AAP? You technically don't need one. Again, Saxon SAS are going to be quite a backbone of your anti-air net, because the cheap AA just isn't quite good. But you can run the base strike rapier if you want something non-radar that is affordable. And of course, with the speed buff, they're not quite as vulnerable anymore. The marksmen are okay. The Centurion, if you want something cheap, it's slow as fuck, but defensively good because of its armor. Or if you want some offensive marksman, you can go with the Challenger, because with its 15 front armor, it's gonna be pretty good against anti-infantry as well. It doesn't die as quickly. Keep in mind though, they do run out of ammo relatively quickly, but you have a FOB, so that's fine. Ace 90 as your AA artillery piece is a solid choice, especially if you run a FOB, then you should go for something like this. Me right now, I'm experimenting with Commonwealth without a FOB, and then run the M108s. But if you run a FOB, I think Ace 90 is probably the way to go. But personally, I would consider upvetting it. It is a lot more accurate as veteran, of course. But here's something you have to keep in mind. It fires in bursts of 3, right? 3 round bursts, and then it has to reload for 30 seconds. Unless you're pinpoint accurate, you're not gonna kill a lot of vehicles with that. And with only 3 rounds per burst, you're not gonna be like really suppressing an area very well, because the sustained fire is just not existent. It's just not sustained. So I would, of course you pay 260 points for 2 of them, but you're gonna be a lot more efficient at actually clearing out town blocks or bushes or something like that than you would be with 1 upvetted. And the other thing is, of course, if you lose 1, your whole card is gone, right? If you lose to counter artillery, to something sneaking around, you lose a whole card of artillery if you only have 1. This is another thing that you have to keep in mind. Losing artillery in your base is a lot more common in 1 versus 1s, because it's easier to sneak around there. Another option is, of course, running either of the M110s. Again, for sustained fire, of course, they fire 2 rounds and then have to reload for 30 seconds. But you get more of them and they hit like a truck. So they're both solid options. The base M110 is going to struggle on big maps because of its range. But they're both very, very solid options. You can also, the last option, because when you're running FOB, is the base M109. You get like 7, I would definitely download them, get a lot of them, a lot of sustained fire, they have a long burst length, not the best rate of fire, but they shoot a lot, like 8 rounds, I think, or maybe even 10 rounds in a burst with like 10 seconds or 8 seconds in between before having to reload for 30 seconds. So you just constantly keep shells coming out of your 4, 5, 6, 7 artillery pieces. Once again, though, they're gonna struggle on big maps, Nuclear Winter, Highway, because they lack range. But it can also be an option. But since I had AS90 in there, I'm gonna keep it in there. But I would strongly consider downvoting it. Mortar, of course, is fine. With the Bison buff, you can go for the Bison, because, you know, with the lack of range on wider maps, if you have to maneuver around, can be a bit awkward. But personally, I still prefer the FV432, just because it carries like 80 rounds more, right? Nearly twice the ammo for the same price, and you typically don't want to resupply them. Some honorable mentions, of course, the ADATs, but for 1v1s, it's more of a meme pick, or rather a pick that, or a unit that you can put in if you just have the spare points, right? I would not rely on that unit because it's so easy to lose and such a point sink for relatively little AA coverage, at least against planes. It has to excuse me, it has to be constantly resupplied, right? It can be just a huge liability. Now tanks, this is the interesting one. Challenger 2 is of course a very, very good tank. Got nerfed to 2 per card, but for 1 versus 1 it's not a big deal. And for team games, I mean, it was honestly just, it was arguably the best super heavy tank. But certainly, even if you consider it to be, not to be the best, there's no way it is comparatively, you know, worse than all the other super heavies other than the Moderna to Varant being 3 per card. It was just stupid. Now, you don't need a Challenger 1 Mark 3. You just straight up don't need it. For only 25 points more, you already get a Challenger 2. And if you want the armor, then you can get very, very similar armor for just, you know, 30 points cheaper. Right? You don't need 2 1 Mark 3s. And you in general don't need this many heavy tanks for 1 versus 1. At least not when you're playing an unarmored deck, and also not when you're playing Commonwealth. Let's just get rid of them. Maxas, a good choice. I would definitely consider upgrading them. 7 is honestly plenty. And for anti-light, like if you just want to kill something like IFVs at longer ranges, you have some other choices, and we'll get to that later. But 7 is plenty. It's just good, it got nerfed by 5 points, and the availability got slightly nerfed, although the availability nerf you only notice if you downvote them, because beforehand, when it was 10-7, right, it's now 8-6, before it was 10-7, Commonwealth also didn't get an availability boost, right? So you still get 7 when you upvote them in Commonwealth, which is kind of funny. Still, 7 is plenty. And then I would run the Challenger 1 Mark 2, got buffed by 5 points. But 19 armor is quite sturdy, 19 AP is good. It lacks rate of fire and speed, of course, like basically all the Challengers other than it, you know, Challenger 2 do. But for 115 points, the armor profile is just very, very good. Although I guess not armor profile, but you know, the armor stats it has. Probably downward because 4 can be a bit too little, because not in every match you want to use the Challenger 2. If you're playing on a big map against a motor deck or something, this is just nearly a dead card. Of course, you don't know beforehand what deck you're playing against, but you don't always need them. So this is already a very sturdy tank type, very solid. Covers a lot of bases. Now, something else you can put in is the Leopard AS1 Plus. Quite a good tank, honestly. But once again, we have something else if you want a cheap, high EP gun. Last but not least, the M41A1. Actually, not last. Just very, very cheap fire support vehicle. It's obviously going to struggle a bit against IFVs and, you know, not going to do much against tanks. But for just 10 points, autonomy is horrible, but the good speed makes up for it. Browning, 8 RPM, decent range and accuracy. Quite a good fire support vehicle. And the Recon version, also for 10 points, but not available to Commonwealth, is being spammed to no end. But of course it has stealth and optics, but even then, being essentially objectively worse if you ignore the tab it's available in and availability, it's still honestly not too bad. What you can also run instead, if you prefer, is the Chieftain Mark II. Autonomy buff from 300 to 400 means it can actually maneuver around the front line now. Now, it doesn't have the best, range, rate of fire, or speed, but 35 points, 11 armor, 4G, good accuracy, nothing to scoff at. IFVs and like light tanks, they're gonna struggle against this thing for only 35 points. Only also has poor optics and not bad optics, which means the optics aren't quite as bad as you might think for 35 points. It is worth running. You can put this in as like your pseudo IFVs if you don't run a TH495. Yeah, not a bad tank at all anymore. Mark V is also not too bad, but I think the actual stats you get, not really worth paying for what the tank is supposed to do. And it's like deal with enemy IFVs and give long range fire support. Recon tab, oh baby. Okay, SPS Lynx H7, very good choice. Definitely go for this. Honestly, the best way to use Lynx H7 drops. You honestly don't need more than 4 in my opinion, simply because you just don't have anything to support your helo drops with as Commonwealth. So investing a lot into H7s isn't a big deal. Having 7 H7s in total, 4 with these and 3 with the Infantry CV, plenty. If you really want more, maybe consider getting it with a Milan 2 or Milan 1. Milan 2 is a bit pricey at 45, but Milan 1 with 55. But Milan 1 for 45 is manageable. But I just wouldn't really focus on them too much. Of course, still try to keep them alive because you have a fob. But they shouldn't really be a key unit, in my eyes. Green Jacket, they're an okay option. Of course, one of the worst shock squads, but they have the speed and HP advantage over line infantry, right? So that's what makes them generally preferable. But don't use them in a Spartan. Unfortunately for Commonwealth, their Recon transport, with optics and stealth, that also costs 15 points, has tracked speed as opposed to wheel speed. It's a tracked vehicle, but it still costs 15 points, just like Ram, Recce, V150, ZZZ56 or whatever the Chinese one is called, you name it. But it's just tracked and slower. Don't run it. If you have only one ground-based Recon infantry, get them in a wheel transport. You want them to be fast at the front line. They should be first there to scout ahead, right? Or be there together with the Saxons. There is SAS with the commandos, etc. So get them in the Pinscour or the Saxon, even the Stalwart if you want it to be amphibious. You don't want to cheap out on such things. You only get 7 of them anyway, so it's like, over the Pinscour, it's like 35 points over the course of the game. Not a huge deal. A's 350s are fine if you want the Recon helicopter. These days I'm using the H1 actually, the Gazelle. For 10 points more, being actually a bit faster, and having better optics, kind of help its survivability a bit. And honestly, I've never felt that I needed more than 4 anyway. But the 350 is still fine, right? Coyote, don't go for this. It does have 2 front armor and a late Bushmaster, but it's still a Bushmaster. It's just gonna get pooped on by virtually any Recon fighting vehicle you're gonna go up against. That's how bad it is. Instead, honestly, just go for the Aslav. Because that is like so cheap that if you lose it, whatever. But cheap, fast, you can just buy one, try to stick it around. If it doesn't work, whatever, you lost only 25 points. And you get a lot more of them. And the damage output against infantry is close to the same. Against vehicles, of course, it's a bit worse. But you're gonna lose most of the time anyway. This is not really something that you should use at the front line. It doesn't have the damage output for that. SF-25 though, like I said, good for just sneaking around, because it has enough firepower to just kill a lot of the CVs you're gonna encounter, a lot of the AA pieces if you go up behind them, and just the autonomy and speed to, drive around the whole map. If you don't want to do that with those, and have them actually be somewhat offensively used, or defensively used even, go for the Scimitar. The Rarden actually is not that much worse than Bushmaster, has actually a higher rate of fire, even though it doesn't show, but of course lower accuracy and no stabilizer. But it also costs only 15 points. That's nothing. So you can spam 3 or 4 around and they're gonna be decent defensively net against like stuff that might try to sneak through. And you're just very, very cheap. But since you have the Coyote, I'm gonna keep the Aslav in, because you might want to use those for the Vickers. And the Vickers, of course, they are your other option to deal with light vehicles. In the past, of course, the Vickers has been around for a long time, but just not very, let's say, effective. Mainly just because Commonwealth just lacked the supporting vehicles for that. Mainly AA. Still, it's not amazing because Stingers on the SAS are a bit low range, but it's much, much better than the Wolverine. And I still stand by the Wolverine being a good unit, but it's just not very good as an offensive use in terms of stopping enemy helicopters. And they are your other option to deal with like light vehicles, IFVs, etc. at longer ranges. That's why you don't need that many maxes. Use them frequently. Use them in 2 or 3 stacks. Maneuver them around the map. Help out on one side if you notice, alright, I don't need much. They're not quite needed there anymore. They have a lot of autonomy. They'll have a lot of speed. Don't be afraid to spend 2 minutes to maneuver around the map, right? That's where their strength lies in. Avery, a good choice as well, got its aim time buffed. Other notable options, honestly, there are none. The SF Tau 2 is actually quite good, but just hard to fit in. But if you want a Tau 2 carrier, that's honestly the best way to go, because for 45 coins, sure, it's only 4 Tau 2s, but you also get a Bushmaster carrier, and it's fast, has 10 HP, so it doesn't die to single mortar fire if you use it defensively. And it fires the Tau 2s in a burst of 2, whereas like the Jeeps here, we'll hold up this one, has to reload after every Tau 2 for 5 seconds. So that's much, much better. Chimera is kind of a meme. It has very good armor, of course, especially for the price. But no turret, no optics. Bad speed. Yeah. Don't bother with this one. Helicopter Lynx 87 Tau 2. It's fine, right? It's fine. Lynx 3, always also like, it's okay for team games, but I wouldn't bother with it for 1 versus 1s because it's a lot easier to lose them to like planes flying around. So, I mean, I'm not a fan of the Tau 2, but it's just like Commonwealth helicopter type. It's just horrible, right? So it's, compared to many, many other decks, just a horrible option, but for Commonwealth gets, it's okay. I don't run it. I run the Lynx 87 20mm. Don't underestimate this little piece of shit. It takes a while to aim. I say this all the time. Because it has no turret. But if it started aiming or finished aiming and starts shooting, the damage output is quite good. It's actually quite a good anti-helicopter unit. As long as you don't go up against like proper anti-helicopter units. Or against like proper gunships with like turreted guns. But for 30 points it's quite good. Can be used for flank defense, base defense even. Yeah, just have it stand stationary, hovering above a bush, around open field. Can do a lot of work there. Even as a scout, because of how cheap it is and how fast. Very, very good all-around purpose unit. We still have 3 AP left, so we could put it in there, but let's wait for now. Air tab. Tornado of 3. There's like 3 good ASF choices if you want to run 1 ASF. There's Tornado of 3, Tornado of 2, and the Hornet. Many years ago, I used to run the Hornet. A while ago, I used to run the F2 and F3 together. Because I like having 2 guys of ASFs. But after a lot of, a bit of experimentation, I've gone back onto Hornet. It just tends to perform better. The gun is better. The AIM-9s have 5 HE. Of course, the Tornadoes, right? They both have 6 and 4 HE respectively, right? 1 Skyflash, 1 AIM-9, that's a kill. 2 Skyflashes, that's a kill. 2 AIM-9s though, not a kill, and the Mauser is just not consistent enough to deal the remaining damage. Lacks the rate of fire, and it lacks even a bit the accuracy. So that's why I would suggest use the Hornet. The Tornado of 3 for the same price and same veterancy, right? The F2 comes on elite. Tornado of 3 for the same price and same veterancy does have more ECM and more long range missiles, although that is not relevant because they're semi-active. But in practice, with the extra accuracy as well on the AIM-9Ms, the Hornet just has been performing better constantly. If you still want something else, go for the Tornado F2. I think it's either Tornado F2 or Hornet. I don't think F3 over Hornet is a good choice anymore. I'm gonna put in the Hornet. Actually, I'm gonna put in the Tornado F2 for now because the F3 was in there before. But you know, Hornet, where is it? There it is. I prefer these days again. The rest is fine-ish. Now here's a kind of a dilemma. I would strongly suggest running Seed as Commonwealth. You have such impactful planes, most notably the F111C, you really want to keep them alive. While you don't always need to rely on your planes, they can do a massive amount of work, right? Your ground units are good, but if you get an F111C train running, being able to keep that up is just going to be so oppressive. So I would strongly suggest running Seed. Now the Kehu, as good as it is, and it is okay, not amazing, it's not quite needed. I feel like a GR7 is typically enough for anti-tank. The problem with the Kehu is it has amazing anti-tank missiles, right? 60% accuracy, good range, fire, forget, 30 AP. Barely gets better than that. But it just has no speed. It gets spotted early, takes ages to arrive, gives the opponent a lot of time to get a tank in cover or to even shoot on your Kehu. So that's why, if you run 4 cards, run a Seed. Run a Seed instead. The value you get out of the F111s and GR7s staying alive is much, much greater on average, I'd say, than you get out of the Kehu. That said, we could remove something to get us 2 extra activation points for a 5th plane. What would that be? That's tough. That is tough. If you are running Lynx H7, I would say you could consider getting rid of this. Although these days I really, really like having a Recon helicopter because it's so useful in ranked. So maybe it's not a good option. Could get rid of the Chieftain Mark II. You have the TH495 for some IFV and sort of anti-IFV. It's a good anti-IFV with 3 armor. So you can get rid of the Chieftain Mark II. And for more affordable fire support, you have the AVRE, of course. So that's probably the best option. Then you can get rid of the not get rid of, but add the Kehu again. Another thing before I finish this, run the Voodoo instead of the Sea Harrier. Voodoo is, and run it down with it. Yes, it is inconsistent, but for 90 points, it does have 50% ECM. It does have stealth. No other seed bin for this price has this survivability. It does have the survivability to afford running one, but it also has the second lowest range seed weapons in the game. Only Cheetah D being lower, of course. So as good as the survivability is with a low range, it's just not as deadly. I would definitely consider running 2 of them. And run it over the Sea Harrier because, well, for one, it's faster and has better ECM, but most notably, it has stealth. The Sea Harrier doesn't have stealth. Sea Harrier is slower. It does have long range and better missiles, but it's slower and no stealth. It gets spotted earlier and gives your opponent more time to react to it. If this had stealth, Sea Harrier would be amazing. Like, actually pogged. It would be so pogged, but it doesn't. So that's, I wouldn't say it kills it, but it just makes the Voodoo, honestly, just a better choice. So yeah, that's the Commonwealth. Biggest changes, of course, to the tank tab, the Recon tab. But you had most of the key units in there. And of course, again, like in the previous time, veterancy, right? Upvet those AA pieces. You typically don't need many of them. Some are survivable, and the Track Rapier is never at the front line because of its horrible anti-helicopter range, right? So upvet them. Increases the accuracy, increases their crit chance. You shouldn't need that many anti-air pieces with SAS around as well. So yeah, as always, of course, let me know what you think, and if you're watching this video, hopefully, because you sent this in, give me your feedback as well, or like some thoughts on something maybe, and what you thought. And of course, you don't have to play this exact deck, right? Listen to what I said and make your own choices if necessary. If you think you don't need it or don't want it, don't run it, right? If you for some reason still want to run the Tornado of 3, go for the Tornado of 3. I'm not saying this is how you have to play this deck. This is the advice based on my opinion, my experience, and do with it what you will, right? So yeah, let me know what you think. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something, and I'll hopefully see you next time. Later.